Carter, hey man, how's it going? Thanks for your work here in week one. Good job on what you've written in both of the discussion forums. I thought I'd send you a video by way of reply. Gives me a chance to connect a little more personally with you since we didn't get to have an in-person discussion this last week and give you some feedback on what you've written. We are going to start our weekly in-person discussion for this class if you're game this Friday, 3 p.m. It'll usually be Fridays at 3, and it will replace the requirements of the second forum each week, as well as commenting on others' posts. So try to make it worth your while to join that in-person conversation here on campus if you can. I think what I want to do in terms of feedback is just underscore a few things that I hear you saying in these first two responses. One is, trying to take seriously as I read you trying to do the the situation of Habakkuk, like how Habakkuk, as a prophet of God, um, presents faith, because I think that that is what Paul is building on. And so if we don't pause to kind of gather that, we'll jump to some things a little prematurely. So, and I feel like the commentators do this. They kind of telegraph almost too quickly what Habakkuk's words mean for Paul's argument in Romans rather than sitting first with like, now, wait a second, like, why is Habakkuk talking about faith? So in that prophecy, it's not that long, and you've talked about it here. But the prophet is like despairing, the prophet is horrified at what Israel's God has allowed to take place, to befall his generation, subjecting them to, rape, pillage, and war at the hands of the Chaldeans, who are no worshipers of the one true God, and yet somehow God is raising them up to deal these terrible blows to Israel. And it's in that context that the prophet hears the Lord say and then delivers as a word of the Lord to his people that while it is true that their life, their place is full of arrogant people and proud people, their oppressors who will exploit their vulnerability and take advantage of the weak. The just, by contrast, will live by faith. And in that context, what it means to have faith is to not be cynical, to not give in to this like dog eat dog way of living in the world in dire circumstances. It's tempting to be cynical in those kinds of situations, to just like look out for number one, look out for mine and what's mine. And, whatever other people have to pay, that's what they have to pay. And Habakkuk is saying that the contrast between that and the way of the just is faith, and that trusting God means concretely trusting God to provide for people's lives, to provide for their well-being, even in impossible circumstances, rather than sort of usurping God's authority, as it were, and trying to do whatever has to be done to get what we want or we need. Instead, the just trust God to provide, and so they can be generous. They can be merciful with others. They don't have to take advantage of the vulnerable for their own gain. They can actually trust God to provide. So that I think is what faith means in Habakkuk. And you can see from what I'm saying already that you can't really pit the faith of God against the faith of the human as if these were alternatives, because the faith of God, that God will act in good faith, is what the human is trusting. It is the substance of human faith. And so I would say when Paul says that the justice of God will be revealed from faith to faith in his thesis statement, and then appeals to Habakkuk as a warrant for this, he's saying that the justice of God is revealed from the faith of God to the faith of the human, that faith of God produces as fruit, um, even in terrible circumstances. And this reaches a kind of fullness in the life of the Messiah, in whom the faith of God and the faith of the human are one, because this is God's own heir, the human being in whom God's own life is invested. And so that's where the faith of the just, you might say, is disclosed in its fullness. And that life of faith is what is spilling out into people like the audience, these non-Jewish people in Rome that Paul is writing to, because it's part of his apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles. And so they're learning this life of Jesus that has been poured into them by the Spirit of resurrection. They're learning to be generous with others as God has been generous with them, to not give up on the needs of others when it seems to compromise their own needs. That seems to be, I think, the way it plays out. And concretely in the letter, this is going to mean learning to share a table with each other across really deep divisions, sharing an economy, possessions with one another, with people that might seem threatening in some ways. All kinds of other ways this is going to play out in the letter. Most immediately, what we're going to see right, starting this next week, week 2, is faith means that we're not judging each other. We're not pretending that we have the authority to rule over one another. Instead, we're trusting God to be the judge, to be the ruler. And this is what enables people to be generous to one another, hospitable to each other. And that, I think, is the aim of Paul's letter and the occasion of his telling of the justice of God in these terms. Anyway, you got some good stuff, I think, just digging into Habakkuk a little bit that's leaning in this direction. And I just want to encourage you to sort of dig as deep as you can into these sources that Paul quotes and then ask, how is this playing out in the thread of Paul's argument in this letter to the Romans? Turning to what you write here in the second forum, I love this because, it's just good to be tracking with our internal process, how a reframing can enable us to encounter something differently. And you've done such a great job just naming that, the different feel of this letter. So often this letter, right, has been presented as a kind of contract. Here's what you have to do in order to get from God what God supposedly wants to give you. And instead, I think you can tell that this letter is about what God has done, the movement of God in the world into which we've already been caught up. And Paul is urging us to be more fully awake to what God is already doing, to who God already is among us and in us in the life of the Messiah that's been shared with us. So good stuff here. I think, there are going to be certain moves that Protestant reformers made with Paul that I'm going to try to vindicate, that I think are good. So I don't want to sort of just dispense with all of that. But I do want to try to read the letter in a way that is responsive as possible to the development of the letter. So all the concrete pastoral difficulties that Paul addresses at the end, we want to see the beginning parts of the letter is oriented towards that, rather than thinking that that's just some kind of arbitrary add-on at the end. I appreciate what you say here at the end, because this is such a good response to our time, which kind of invokes this, to my mind, false multiculturalism, where we're all just neutral, we're post-race, we're post-gender, we just all love each other. It's just not true, right? It's not honest about what has shaped us, what our particular commitments and desires and fears are. And so what you're signaling here at the end, I think, is great, because Paul's argument is that God's welcome to all of the peoples of the world depends on God's faithfulness to the Jews. So it's not about dispensing with the particulars of people. It's about God investing God's life and future in the particulars of a community in a way that then uh, delivers welcome salvation to other peoples of the world in their particulars as they come into relationship with the particulars of Israel. Um, so that I think is just a good sensibility. Psychologically, it's so important because these days people are going to come into your clinic, your practice, whatever that's like, all the time with what I would say are kind of false hopes about being able to um, just be neutral and loving and open to everybody and all that kind of stuff. And they're burdened with these like myths of what we're supposed to do and unable to see that the particulars of their life, the prejudices that they've inherited, the the relationships that make them who they are, these are all constitutive of who they are. They are crucial to take seriously, to own, to process, to digest, and to see that their future is about um, embracing, engaging, and reforming those particulars of their life rather than pretending that they can set them aside in favor of some abstract ideal. So I think there's a lot we can tease out of the structure of Paul's gospel in this sense of moving from or always um, embracing what God has already done, you might say, in how God continues to spread the gift of the gospel salvation in the world. Feel free to reply to this, by the way, with anything that you want to bring up. No pressure to do that, though. If you don't reply with anything, if you don't mind just writing like received or something like that, so I know you got the video and came through okay. But great to have you in the class, man. Looking forward to continuing the conversation, maybe in a little bit more of a smaller setting, too, if you can make the groups on Friday. I often we're in these settings where there's tons of people and lots of different things going on, and it's nice to find a setting where it's a little bit smaller scale and we can kind of go to work on some stuff. But thanks again for the great work here in week one, and looking forward to the conversation throughout the summer.